Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Early AI podcast. My name is Seth Earley.
And I'm Chris Featherstone.
And today we're really excited to introduce our guest who has been around the search industry for many, many years. He's really understood the core tenets of search. He's done lots of search implementations, and he's at the forefront of two things that I think are very, very important: large language models and search security, enterprise search security. Those are two critical areas because at the end of the day, we're using large language models and generative AI to access information, the source of truth in the enterprise. And of course, without security considerations, that doesn't work very well, right? And we've learned that in implementations, and we've also heard apocryphal stories about that. So our guest today is known for his extensive experience in enterprise search and enterprise product development regarding search. He's presented to some very key industry figures, such as the CTO of NASA and the CIO of the Marshall Space Center. Currently, he's very involved in the space of internal search adoption and data governance at Big ID. John Lenker, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Seth.
It's great to have you. And go ahead.
Not that the applauding, like right in the in-between.
Yes,
we need that applaud. Like,
that's right.
Yeah,
we'll have to have that added in as the effects. So
right next to the laugh track button too. You need the laugh track.
Exactly. At all of our corny jokes. Anyway, so all of our search jokes. We're looking for search jokes from you today. So if you have any search humor, you can certainly insert that. So we'd love to start the show by kind of looking at where people have misconceptions about AI, specifically about search, about security, about all of those things. And what I really wanted to do is have you kind of talk about your experience in enterprise search and data security. What are the things that are most significant in terms of misconceptions that you've encountered in search, in security, in artificial intelligence, in information architecture? I know we're both big fans of IA. And so, John, why don't you give us your thoughts about some of those misconceptions that you run into?
Sure. I think there are two main categories that I've seen. One is on the sales front, if you're trying to sell search solutions and you're a company evaluating a search solution. The other is on the opposite of the sales front. It's more of the implementation and use front. From the sales front, a lot of misconceptions I see is that, for example, I work in a tech company, and this tech company has specific skills, and they make a product that's good at one particular thing that happens to not be search.
Mm-hmm.
But because there is technical expertise and there's ingenuity and there's desire inside the company, the overall mentality is, well, it's better for us to just build this solution. So from the search vendor standpoint or the search platform company standpoint, I'm always thinking about the big picture, which is what I've tried to communicate internally at my current company, which is if we're selling to someone in the data governance and privacy space, and they're a tech company, and they believe that we have in-house expertise that can do this, well, how hard can it be, is the attitude. We can do all this other cool tech stuff. Why can't we just build data governance and privacy platform? Well, is that really your expertise? And do you want to be maintaining that? Do you want to have to keep up with all the vendors in the space that you would have to deal with? Or would you rather purchase a solution and have a lot of that work offloaded from you onto what you're good at doing? And so I see that as a huge misconception in the search industry. So if you're a company evaluating search, especially if you have technical expertise, do you have it in search, which is not as simple as typing something into a bar, hitting enter, getting 10 blue links from Google. It's not, as you know, it's way more complicated than that. Now it's way more capable. And thus you shouldn't treat it as simply as what I'm seeing in terms of those misconceptions in the sales category.
Yeah, and the question really is, when you start looking at those areas, are those core competencies? Is building a search platform or a security platform, a data governance platform, is that your core competence? And if it is not,
Exactly.
outsource it to somebody who does have that as a core competence. But even if you take the search platform and capability and set that aside, there's still a lot of issues around do it yourself, buy versus build, configuration versus pre-configured, and then all sorts of issues around what's going on in this Gen AI space that leads to some common problems and misconceptions. So that's on the sales side, where people kind of run into that a lot, and then the answer to that is really, do you really understand the depth and breadth of this problem in this problem space? And do you really want to get into all the endless iterations of building that? So that's a really great point. If you wanted to say more about that, feel free. But did you want to touch on the other piece, the implementation piece?
Yes, and this is, I think, one case that exists in between both of those categories. It could be labeled as either, both sales and use. And that is, our company is unique. We have unique needs. We have a higher standard to adhere to because we, for example, we secure data. We're in the business of privacy. We're in the business of security, whether that be data security, whether it be you're a single sign-on provider, like an identity provider, whatever it may be. If you're in the tech space, I've seen this a lot. You think you're unique. And thus, when you're looking at search solutions, you say, well, we can't do what everybody else does because we have special needs. And the message that I keep trying to send to the prospects and anybody else that will listen, frankly, is you're not special from the standpoint of search. If it's good enough for NASA, if it's secure enough for NASA, it's secure enough for you, tech company that has $100 million in revenue, that's good enough for you. And so from the aspect of sales, that this meets the category of sales because you're trying to convince the person that you don't have unique needs. You actually need to consider yourself just like everybody else. You have data that you want secure. You want things to be findable yet not exposed to danger. And you want people to be satisfied and efficient doing what they're paid to do, which is find information. And then on the use and implementation side, you're not unique as in it is possible for you to trust a search vendor with your information because they're not going to try to replace your system of record. So let's say they want you to they want to crawl your Confluence and your Salesforce information, your Google Drive, whatever it may be. They're not going to replace that as a system of record. So again, you're not unique in the sense that everything has to be hoarded and clutched into your hands and in your grasp. You are just like any other company that needs their information findable, and there are people that are going to do that for you, but you're not special from the standpoint of search. And that's something that I have to communicate often to just keep people realistic about this.
Yeah, there's a common set of capabilities that people require, that organizations require. And of course, the way they execute that, and this is where you start thinking about, efficiency versus competitive advantage. You need efficiency, but the way you are implementing this specifically in your environment is what's going to be different about your information profiles, your information needs, your use cases, your differentiating competitive IP, and all those things, right? So there's a certain set of common functionality that, yes, it completely applies across industries. And then there's the unique differentiation where you are an individual little snowflake that is based on how you use your information, what you name things, how you need to go to market, how you differentiate, how you deal with your customers, how you deal with employees, and all of those things. And all that becomes kind of an interesting set of requirements when you start looking at the execution piece. And that's where I think a lot of the tech companies that try to implement these things internally kind of miss a little bit of the boat because they do have the tech chops to do technical implementations, but it's really on the business side when you start to get into some of those unique intricacies and nuances.
Yeah, that is very true.
You almost get into the special needs, though, of this when it's legacy systems that haven't been updated and they don't want to touch them. Seth, to your point in terms of getting some of that access to that information, but you get this scenario where what they believe what makes them unique is their approach to the market, whatever. What made them unique is not what makes them unique now. Most of that is because they had some, we'll say, systems that were contemporary at the time and they haven't touched them or updated them. And now that becomes the special need, is trying to get access to that information, which is hard, right? So now you get into all the app modernization stuff that goes on as well. And they don't believe maybe that that's the sticky point and or the linchpin in all of it. You ever run into those type of scenarios as well? Because that's what I find, is that's what they believe makes them used to make them unique, and now they're not unique anymore because of, to your point.
I've seen that when it comes to migration from a traditionally on-prem data source, and you probably know this extremely well doing what you do, going to some cloud data source. Maybe there's a corporate initiative to move everything to the cloud. You hear people say cloud first, and that's wonderful. But what does that actually mean when it comes to findability of information? There's a whole separate conversation we could have about security and governance and removing the rot, the redundant, old, and trivial information. Do you really want to keep that when you put everything in something like AWS? There's that part of it. But then how do you find it? The stuff that you want to migrate, how do you find it? So the point you're making about the modernization piece, I see it a lot with where does this stuff live? And when I go to find it, how do I connect to where it lives now versus what I did before? And the benefit and the advantage that people see is it'll be better if it's in the cloud because it's quote unquote modern. And so it should be easier to connect to. But now you've introduced another layer of security that is required that wasn't there before when you had it in your data center on your corporate property. So there's another side to it. I still think it's a great way to go, but I think you're making a good point about modernization, not just of the application, but where does this stuff live, the data that you want to find?
Yeah, all of that infrastructure. Did you have a follow-on comment or question, Chris?
No, I think I was just going to at some point want to double click into, like you said, that other discussion about security, because it does raise a bunch of other security risks, right? I think that's part of it is helping folks understand, like to your point, being on-prem is not a bad thing. Being in the cloud is not the end all be all either, right? So we have a good fine balance depending on the use case and whatever the customer's focus on. At the same time, the searchability of content is super important, but not everything needs to be searchable to everybody. So locking that down, putting the right mechanisms in place, the governance and guardrails, all of that kind of stuff. Talk a little bit about that in terms of what you've seen, the evolution of where it is, and maybe even where you would like to see it go. Like, what does that look like to you in the work you do?
I think this is a good introduction to this whole concept of RAG and what RAG is doing for findability of information. And anyone listening that doesn't know this term, it simply stands for retrieval augmented generation. And I think when you look to the future, all the analysts say this. I know, Seth, you and I have talked about this before. All the analysts that research cognitive search engines and analyze all of these sorts of operations say the interaction that people expect to have with things like ChatGPT is the future of all technical interactions.
Yes.
And so it used to be you had 10 blue links coming from Google and you type something in, you found the 10 blue links. That was groundbreaking. I remember that was so cool. Even talking about things like Alta Vista and Yahoo back in the day. And then we moved to Google, and Google had the 10 blue links. And then there was this giant push into enterprise search, and you had companies like Fast who now made things so much easier in terms of if you're a company, let's say like Auto Trader, and you want all of these vehicles across all these different dealers to be findable, things like Fast made that so easy because of the technology at the time allowed you to customize your customers' needs, meaning how am I going to search for stuff? How am I going to filter? All that stuff. It kind of packaged it. And then we moved into more of a corporate internal sort of search where you had SharePoint really go boom in terms of success, and everybody wanted everything in SharePoint. Okay, we've got SharePoint as our company intranet. We've got to get everything findable in there, put it all in there. The entire company has existed for the purpose of connecting data systems or sources to SharePoint and crawling it into Microsoft Search. And now we're at this new forefront of it's no longer good enough. What did all those things share? The things I just mentioned, what did they all share? From a user interaction standpoint, they shared I must type some keywords into a box. And we were limited to statistical or keyword-based search. And now this new forefront is I'm no longer going to type keywords. I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to phrase them as questions, even like with my voice. If I were to interact with Siri or Alexa or something, I'm going to start those sorts of interactions that way. And instead of getting links and documents and results, I'm going to get synthesized answers that include references to where the generative technology found the material. That's the whole essence of RAG is, can I find the material and then can I package it up nicely for the user to be more efficient with what they find, the results? And that, I think, Chris brings up a great point about, you brought up a great point about the security that's inherently risky in that sort of endeavor, just like it was when the whole corporate search thing went boom. SharePoint, the sudden fear was, oh no, the HR documents are exposed and the engineers don't have permission to the HR documents. What if they find them? Got to make sure that that's secured down to the document level. All that is still true. It's just the manner of interaction to finding it is now different and it's more conversational. So the element is still there. We just have to go to a few more lengths to make sure the security is still intact.
Such a great point. I think we talked a little bit about the story of a pharmaceutical company we were working with, where their portfolio review application was an isolated application. They had such strict security rules that even certain executives on the executive leadership council were not allowed to see certain documents and certain information because it was such market moving information. Companies they're looking at acquiring, phase 3 clinical trial results, new drug development, new molecular entities, and so on. And then and we overlaid a large language model on top of that application to have conversations with it. Then when Microsoft Copilot was deployed, it was deployed across the enterprise and everything was visible to it. And suddenly they started freaking out because, everybody could see what was in this portfolio review application. And it became, a crisis that I had to deal with over the weekend by driving to my developer's home to find him. Luckily, he lived in the same town and, we were able to solve it, but it became a very, very urgent, pressing issue. We just had to lock it all down. But that is something people are not thinking about. And you had told a story about a vendor you were talking to and asking them about how they handled document level security, and the answer that you received was quite surprising. Do you want to
Yes,
tell
there
the
was.
story? You don't have to name names.
Was that the search vendor or was
Yeah,
that
I think it's the search vendor, or maybe it was a RAG vendor. But when they said no, we don't have that, it was like, what? It's like,
yeah, I won't name names, but
yeah, right.
this is part of a group of companies, and I don't say this with any arrogance or any judgment. I understand companies go through evolutions and
Sure.
you start somewhere and you build, but this particular vendor wanted to be a player on the enterprise level for search solutions, and my company was interviewing them in a sales context for a as a potential vendor. And so I was called on with my expertise in this area, and I just started asking questions. The first question I asked was, do you offer document level security? First of all, they needed clarification on what that meant, which was alarming to me. And then when I clarified it, the answer was, we don't offer that. The best we can do is put people in a list and say, these people belong to team X, and team X has access to source A, B, and Z, but not D. And I thought, okay, well, what about the documents within source A? If team X should not view some of those documents, you're telling me it's just all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yes. And they said, well, currently that's all that we can do is what I just described. And I went, I thanked them. And then internally, when we discussed it, I said, this has to stop here. This discussion's
It was
over.
not a starter.
Yeah, because now your goal is to get a generative technology in front of this. And Seth, you brought up the Copilot example, which the things that Copilot has exposed thus far unintentionally are frightening. But this is an example of, you put a generative technology in front of something like this without any kind of document level restriction, you are asking for so much trouble. And I'm not talking about just the Copilot incident where the CEO's salary is revealed to the whole company, anybody that asks. I mean, much more serious things, like, for example, intellectual property.
Right.
Things that could, to your point about the pharmaceutical, if that information, even in the right person's hands, were to somehow escape that person's hands, you're talking about a completely monumental change in the stock price, perhaps,
Right.
because you're talking about so there are examples where this is cataclysmic in nature, and other examples where it's fairly innocent. But the same thing to me is always true. If you can't do that as a search product, meaning if you can't secure an item at the document level, then you should not be in it in the enterprise business.
Yeah. And so, and that is regardless of the mechanism of access, right? Whatever that access mechanism. Right now, we're talking about generative search and generative AI and generative interactions, which are more true conversations, natural language conversations, which is what everything is evolving to. But it really kind of doesn't matter what that mechanism is. That's a fundamental piece that if you don't start with that, you're going to have problems. And so there's also the other fear about generative AI, and that is releasing information to the public or to a model. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what some of the safeguards can be around ensuring that your IP is secure, even with a generative AI? Even if you have document level security, what about IP? The right people are getting access to this information, but what about exposing that IP to a model, a training of a model? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and one follow-on point to the previous discussion before we get into that. We talked about how things change and evolve for search, and we went through the sort of the 2 or 3 decades worth of that. The one thing, the huge leap I see in the security standpoint is when you're talking about generative AI, the big leap I see in security, meaning now it's going to be tougher, the leap to in terms of difficulty, is before it was fine for you to secure documents at the document level to a user or a group, and you had grant lists and deny lists, and these people can explicitly see this, these people can explicitly not see this, and so on and so forth. That was all fine and adequate. But now when you talk about generative AI, you introduce the possibility that if it doesn't have sufficient information, it will just make it up. So not only are we are dealing with the risk of exposing the wrong information, exposing factual information to the wrong person. Now we're dealing with the risk of exposing something potentially hallucinated to the wrong person. So that's an extra layer of difficulty I see. But
or even to the right person if it's the wrong information.
Right, with the stock price pharmaceutical example. But then with the question you just asked, so in 2023, I built RAG applications for a number of prospects and customers, and almost always, probably 90+% of the time, the first question, 100% of the time, it was a question at some point, but 90% of the time, the first question was, I don't want to call ChatGPT and give it even information you retrieve through your search engine, because who's to say OpenAI is not going to just use that to augment their model? And so there were a couple ways that we had to mitigate this risk. The first was Microsoft, since they were controlling the OpenAI calls that we were making, would allow you to enter an NDA such that there would be no augmentation of the public model for ChatGPT. So this has now evolved into ChatGPT Enterprise. So now OpenAI is kind of taking care of this by themselves. But prior to ChatGPT Enterprise being released, there was this NDA that you could sign with Microsoft as a proxy for OpenAI saying, none of the information you send me in an API payload will be used to augment our public model. And there's all these legal consequences if, in fact, that occurs. That was one way. The other way was to employ governance and security tools ahead of or in front of search that would redact certain information. So let's say you were dealing with PII and you were dealing with information in a corpus like social security numbers or email addresses, medical records. You could still use that information retrieved to the right person. Let's say the user had the ability to see it from a security standpoint, but you didn't necessarily need that social security number exposed. You just needed the fact that this person's personal information exists. We just don't need to know exactly what it is. We had ways of being able to redact information to the point where the generative AI could still function and say, yes, so-and-so is a customer. They are a customer for this period of time. Their personal information exists, but it's not visible to me, quote unquote, the ChatGPT saying me, because it's been redacted, things of that nature. So that was another way to mitigate the risk. That's about as far as I know we can go right now with retrieval augmented generation. ChatGPT Enterprise has helped a lot with the first point, which was giving information to OpenAI in general. So now there's a nice dividing line between you just going to chatgpt.com and messing around. That's totally public. But now there's another layer of ChatGPT Enterprise.
And there is, on the individual level, there are some, it's a little bit buried. It's a little bit hard to find, but you can opt out at the individual level. I recently learned. So you can go in there and you can execute an opt-out request, and then you will get a written confirmation saying that your data that you're putting into your generative AI requests will not be used to train the public model. Most people don't know about that, and it's pretty hidden. But I think those are really good points. And then, of course, the other way of thinking about it is using a private model behind your firewall where you have more control. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was the third sort of backup way for our prospects when dealing with RAG applications. And the reason I say it was a backup method is usually it was a much more expensive method because you would have to procure a custom, so to speak, model for your purpose, but that would act like ChatGPT. And since 2023, I know it sounds like that's a long time in the past, but since then, you know how fast this stuff moves. We've seen the advent of companies like Harvey, who produces models for legal practices, law firms. We have a company out there called Cohere that is in the business of creating a private model that acts just like the best LLM on the market in terms of function, but is specifically within, like you said, the firewall of your company. And so that was a solution I would point towards as the third option, only because they would ask for a lot of money for that. At least they did in 2023. So those were solutions for the diehard, absolutely not, I'll never engage ChatGPT or even something like Claude. I'll never use it for my corporate information, even if it is controlled through RAG and we're so confident in the security. No, some people just drew a hard line, and that's where you'd have to say, well, if you still want to do this, because remember that the whole conflict ultimately is I want this cool functionality and I want all the positives this thing brings, but I don't want to deal with any of the negatives.
Yeah.
So everybody wants their cake and eat it too, but they realize you can't have the cake unless you're willing to give up a little bit of the ingredients so that we can actually work for you. You have to do something or else you're never going to accomplish anything. So then meeting that person that had that attitude in the middle was, could you look at something like Cohere or Harvey?
I try to do that with my kids. I want only the good, none of the bad. It never works. It's like these.
Is there an offline model? Is there a model for that? No. Yeah.
So, John, you're talking about, really, it's. I love the fact that you're outlining really a maturity model here, right? Because we're going from RAG, and then we talk about, just off the shelf. I mean, McKinsey talked about it as their taker, maker, shaker, perspective, right? Where you're going to, just take a model off the shelf and just use it, right? Or you're going to take and fine tune a model, right? That maps directly into the data needs and stuff you have, or you're going to build your own, right? So what type of, do you ever get into like maturity models and or talk about it at that level with the organizations? Because everybody believes they're a builder. Everybody believes that like to your point that they're the most innovative, and they're really not. And so now it's just a matter of, hey, you want time to value, you have multiple use cases. Some may use this model that's just off the shelf, and that's great. But you may want to fine tune this model or to get away from prompt injecting and some of those other, techniques that people try to hack stuff with, right? How do you articulate that to your customers, or is that something that's interesting that you find that you talk about?
I love that question because it is interesting when the company that you're dealing with has this propensity for data science. So you're dealing with a company like NVIDIA, let's say. They're not an actual customer of mine. I'm just thinking about who's really well known that has a tremendously huge and capable data science team. If you approached NVIDIA and said, I know you have a problem with findability. Search is obviously not your core competency, to Seth's point, but we could still use you. We can use the fact that you have in-house expertise in data science. So my recommendation is to have the best of both worlds, the cake and eat it. You build a model or augment a model like take a version of Claude and augment it, or Llama or something. Take that and augment it to your purposes. And what are your purposes? Often it's company specific acronyms, that sort of language, because in traditional search, you can do that with synonyms and phrasing and all that. But the generative models are so good at that sort of thing already if you just give them the right foundational training sets. So yeah, augment a model that exists
Mhm.
so that you could leverage the horsepower of something like Claude, but do it in such a way that is domain specific. So yes, if you have a company that you're dealing with that is really into data science, they don't have to be tinkerers like the earlier example I was giving, where you're a tech company, you like to build stuff. We think we can do this. No, I mean specifically this love or pursuit of data science, an in-house data science team, then yes, that would be a great candidate for something like that, I think.
And when you think about, there's this new kind of trend around smaller language models, and I've even heard small action models, agentic approaches. There's a lot of new acronyms and new terminology. But essentially, I look at a small language model as something that's fine-tuned for particular purposes, a little lighter weight, but has the capability to process very specific information, usually tuned with a corporate ontology, as you say, your own acronyms, your terminology, your IP, your procedures, your product names, your troubleshooting, your engineering drawings, all of those types of things, all of the organizing principles behind them. Do you want to talk about this kind of trend to look at smaller language models, and maybe they're a little less compute intensive, maybe a little less costly? How are you seeing that in the search space? And talk a little bit about what some of the vendors are doing, if you could, the Coveos, the Cinequas, those types of organizations. And because they do usually come packaged with a language model for doing things like entity extraction or auto classification. Sometimes those are industry specific, sometimes those are broader. There are industry specific language models like SciByte for life sciences. I still find those to be too big and too cumbersome and really containing a lot of irrelevant terminology. But what are your thoughts around some of those trends? It's a much more complex and varied landscape than people would imagine.
I agree. I think there are a lot of points in that question. One of them is when I referenced earlier something like Harvey. I think Harvey, even though it depends on who you ask, I think opinions vary, but Harvey could be considered a large language model because it acts like one.
Mhm.
But in reality, it's more like a small language model that, or even an action model that is geared toward quite a specific purpose. And that is, if you ask the same legal sort of question, and by legal question, I mean, if you're an attorney and you're going through depositions and you need to summarize certain depositions from multiple witnesses or multiple uh,
Mhm.
targets of deposition, then a large language model like a generic one like ChatGPT would do that, but not in a way that would be as meaningful to an attorney who's looking for a specific flow or summary. Something like Harvey is geared towards that. So it's almost small in the fact that, yes, it works in a particular industry with a speciality, but it's also behaving like a large language model. So there is that. The other thing that you asked about with how are the search vendors using this, most of the vendors, the biggest players in the space, and by that I mean not just revenue success, but on the Magic Quadrants and the Forrester Wave, Gartner Quadrant, the people that are in the leader space are offering plug and play capabilities. So yes, they'll ship with usually an inference model that will process user queries,
Mhm.
but they will always give you the option of plugging in a model for the response or the synthesis part of the other side. So the G in the RAG acronym, they're going to offer you the ability to use your own model. And they've often set up ahead of time connections to multiple different options like Llama, ChatGPT, a number of different sort of mainstream options. But then, for example, if you have a company like NVIDIA that says we like to build our own models for all these other purposes, we're going to build an LLM, quote unquote, for retrieval or for a search process like RAG, then you could put that into the equation, and that's where the best search companies in terms of flexibility are offering that plug and play.
Mhm. Right. Choose your own language model and also incorporate your terminology. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complex or convoluted, because one of the things we talked about in the prep call was, at what point are you doing security trimming? Because when you think about doing the retrieval itself, concept is you're building a vector index and then you're querying that vector index. And the question becomes, are you importing content, enriching those embeddings with your content along with security details? Is your vector similarity search working against that sort of, I don't want to say security trim, but security enhanced vector space? Or are you doing a different type of a query against the more standard index and then doing a vector similarity? Like where does the vector space come in? Where does the true RAG piece of this, the whole idea of where are you querying and where are you trimming, right? Because that starts to get into some pretty technical nuance.
Yeah.
Great question. I think the main concern of when you did security trimming was around performance, at least historically. So the main reason you wanted an early binding sort of security method was, well, it's going to be so costly, especially to the user experience, if I wait to get the results set and then I dynamically go call these sources for their permissions and then start dropping stuff. If you did it on that end, it would result in a poor experience. Now with hardware being so cheap and hardware being so much better, it's not as much of a concern for performance reasons. But I think you're bringing up a great point, which is if I'm going to semantically evaluate somebody's query and try to retrieve the most semantically relevant information to that query, I have to obviously vectorize that. And it depends on who you ask. So some companies like Cinequa, they do it in a proprietary way where they blend a semantic and a keyword search into one. And with their model, they look at the best relevancy scores from both sets of retrievals. But under the covers, it's unified in terms of security identity. So not only is your identity singular in nature, as in you have a particular login for SharePoint, you have a different login for some other system. And by different, I mean, let's say with one system, you're known by your email address, another system, you're known by first letter, last name, whatever it may be. Companies like Cinequa that operate in this more mature model, they understand you as a user in one form. So they look at you ahead of time based on all your different identities across these systems. They unify it into one. And therefore, it's much easier to then filter out or trim items in a result set. Now, when they're semantically evaluating your query and getting information both from a keyword and a semantic standpoint or a vectorized standpoint, they already know where the keyword information is coming from and the semantic, or excuse me, the vector information, because they know the origin document. The document, let's say the document came from SharePoint. SharePoint is almost 100% of the time going to have Active Directory permissions imposed on it. Sometimes SharePoint has its own permissions, but most people use Active Directory. And therefore, we have who can see and can't see this item in SharePoint. Companies at the enterprise level for search are going to honor that permission. And when they build vectors of information out of that document that came from SharePoint, they still know where the document came from because that's fundamental to the RAG process. You must be able to cite where you got the information to give the user confidence that they're not getting a hallucination back. So because we have the reference, we know the permissions on the document, which make the trimming process pretty straightforward when you're using it in this RAG context versus the traditional context. That's how I don't see a huge departure there, only because fundamentally it's the same. We still need to know who can see the origin content, and it came from a document wherever that lived. And as long as that's secured, we can impose it just like we could on the document itself. We can impose it on the vectors also.
Now you're just exposing the chain of thought, which goes into the explainability of which a lot of organizations don't think about it from, because what you're outlining to me is, hey, listen, this is not anything new. And there's not anything that's so revolutionary here that all we're doing is we're saying this is the data and the data had this permissions on top of it. Now we're just applying a natural language understanding on top of that. And it still takes into consideration the inheritance of what you already had in place. So reuse what you have in place. Don't throw it all out. Just remember that you had this in place and it mapped to your policies and procedures anyway. And now let's honor that going forward. And then let's put in, now I will add, let's put in some specific things that may, enable let's say, more contemporary technologies to think about that, but you're still utilizing your old inheritance models of what you can and can't do with identity and access management. That's really what it boils down to. So
Yeah, then you're touching on the most important reason I think to consider buying these solutions versus building them, because I hear all this talk in the market about how I'm gonna create a RAG solution piecemeal. I'm gonna do it myself. Well, how am I gonna do that? Well, first I'm gonna find something that'll connect to my data sources and extract information or crawl it. Then I'm gonna go build or buy a vectorizer that'll break it all up into vectors and chunk it. Then I'm gonna go buy Pinecone or MongoDB Atlas, and I'm gonna put all this stuff in one of those. So I'm gonna maintain that separately. But the thing that people always forget in this process, at least the people I've talked to, is what about the security of that? So you pulled all this stuff out because you wanted to get it out of there, of course. Did you get it out with the security on it? Or are you planning to do that at runtime? Because if you do it at query time, yes, we talked about how performance isn't as big a factor as it used to be, but it's still not the best way to do it.
Right.
It's not efficient. And you could expose potentially a miss in the query time process that would have not been missed had it been done at crawl time or at the time of vectorization. So that is to me one of the main reasons you want to get a solution that already does this well and it's their core competency. Because now if you do it piecemeal, if something goes wrong, someone's gonna get blamed in your
Mhm.
company because you built it. And
Right.
not to mention, you're gonna have to maintain it. What if Mongo
Right.
changes their APIs? And so now you have to maintain all of your interactions with all of these different pieces. Whereas these mature vendors, they have everything
Sure.
packaged for you, even if you can plug and play a model to do whatever you need to do. It's built for you. And
Right.
it just takes so much of the work and worry off of an organization. This is not your competency. My advice is not to do it.
Right. Don't do this home. So we're talking now about how does the information architecture fit in? Because, we know that search is all about content quality and IA, right? We know that the better your metadata is, the better your search results are. When people say make it like Google, I always say, put as much time, energy, and resources into optimizing your content as people do who want to get good search rankings, and it will be like Google. So when you think about applying information architecture, metadata, taxonomies, ontologies, all of that stuff, what we're trying to do is we're trying to define the isness and aboutness of a piece of content so that it's more retrievable in the right context for the right individual. So how does this fit in when you can either do that by importing your IA with the chunks so you can semantically enrich those embeddings, right? You can enrich those embeddings so that in the vector space, it contains additional signals on that content, on that chunk content, which is what we did with that life sciences firm. Or you can say, well, I'm going to maintain a separate index that's going to be a more traditional index that I can do faceted retrieval on and so on. And then I'm going to try to integrate these or have higher, combine the relevancy scores or something along those lines. Tell me your thoughts around how to do that. What are the different implications around different search engines? And then how do you make the best use of an information architecture, corporate ontology language model that is specific to the enterprise and to their processes and IP? Is that a fair question?
Yes, I just had to gather my thoughts on it for a second.
Hmm.
I think there are two main ways to do this. One is to do it ahead of time, similar to the way somebody might want to do OCR.
Hmm.
If anyone's listening that's not familiar, optical character recognition. Let's say you're an oil and gas company, you have land leases in Texas that are decades old, maybe even over a century old. It's all going to be either handwritten or typed. You've scanned it as a PDF. It's not readable by a search engine, and among other things. So OCR is one example of this, but what you just mentioned, meaning classifying the content, naming entities within the content, there are things out there that will do this for you just in place. There are APIs you can call for Google and Microsoft and Azure that will go and do these sorts of one-off type of operations, and they'll label content. They'll do all these. Microsoft has an action where you can go back and through MIP label content in SharePoint in a reverse direction. So there are ways to do this when it sits in place. And then the other way to do it, the second way, is to have a search product or a search technology do it for you when it crawls the content
Mhm.
and it examines it. And the best
Yeah, which
products
is
on the
the
market,
index. Mhm.
yes, as it puts the content into the index, it will do these things in the process.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
I've always, when I've consulted customers on the best practices here, yes, there are lots of variables, but you take the example of OCR, there are tools out there for OCR that are better than what search engines will do.
Mm.
And a lot of people use the same libraries from the same open source vendors to do this stuff.
Mhm.
But again, they're just like any other of these services. OCR is a service you can pay for on a document basis through something like Google. Same thing for naming entities or for classification. You can pay for these services, or you can have a search product do it. The best search products on the market will work with something that's been classified, been entity recognized, so on and so forth in place. And they will also offer you a solution to do it while you index the content. So earlier you mentioned SciByte for a scientific specific
So,
purpose.
yeah. Mhm.
Plenty of open source things like Spacey for naming entities. I don't love Spacey for, I think there's a lot of noise in a lot of these open source things, but all that stuff exists. The
Mhm.
best products out there are the ones that will allow you to choose your option that's best for you. And if you want to do it outside the search product, then they're happy to work with that. I think you also made a point about, do we keep a separate index that's full of keyword or statistical based searching capability as well as our vectors? There are companies out there, and one I'm very familiar with, that does just that in a proprietary way. And they blend those two things upon query into a result set to
Mhm.
get the best of both worlds. I don't see a huge advantage in one over the other, which way
Mhm.
you choose to do it. I think there are cases to be made for both, but I think it's good to talk about what is involved in doing both and what to look
Mhm.
for. And I think what you should look for is a product, like I said, that will allow you to do it on your own. They won't force you to, okay, well, if you want named entities to show up in your search results, then you must use our named entity recognition product or
Mhm.
mechanism. I don't like that limitation because not everybody has the need for your particular idea of what named entity recognition should look
Mhm.
like. So
Mhm.
I like the products that will allow you to both use them for more of a hands-off turnkey
Mhm.
solution, but also back to the early example about data scientists that will allow you to use that too, should you have the desire and the expertise.
Right, right, great. So, wanted to switch gears a little bit and learn a little bit more about you. How did you get into this space? Tell us a little bit about John, the person, and what do you do outside of work? Just give us a little bit of the history.
Oh, thank you. I don't realize I didn't even realize we were coming up on the hour.
I know
How
it's amazing how
fascinating the
quickly
topic
that's
is.
gone.
And these have been fantastic questions, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
How did I get into this space?
yeah.
In 2008, I was a software developer. I have a computer science degree, and I was just a programmer. And I got a call from a recruiter in 2008, and he said, "I'm interviewing for a company in Atlanta. They want somebody who's willing to learn enterprise search." And I said, "What is enterprise search?" And he said they specifically want someone that has a development background but is willing to learn something new,
Hmm.
and they need someone that understands the development side of what is involved with search. And what I'm referring to specifically is how you tinker with fast ESP when it used to
Mhm.
exist.
Yeah.
And so
Great.
I interviewed with someone who became my very close friend. In fact, in the latter stages of 2023, I exchanged more text messages about employment opportunities as a friend with this person than anybody else, more than my wife, more text messages than anybody else. So this guy that hired me in 2008 as a contractor to work on a fast project for a big company here in Atlanta, he became the person who introduced me to search and taught me about it. And then
Wow.
I sort of followed him everywhere he went after that because I got hooked on search and he
Mhm.
made all these opportunities materialize for me.
Nice.
And we were together at Cinequa for a while. We're now apart again,
Uh-huh.
which has been the case on and off 16 years, but that's how I got into the space.
Mhm.
As far as me as a person, I have a 6-year-old son, and he is a baseball player. He's
Mhm.
playing soccer. I'm
Mhm.
coaching him in baseball. I'm
Nice.
really into weightlifting and snowboarding, so I'm on a
Nice.
5-day a week weightlifting program. I
Great.
take 1 or 2 snowboarding trips a year. I'm totally addicted to that, but I'm also totally handcuffed because I live in Atlanta. So if you want to go snowboarding, you need to get on an airplane. If you're
Right.
listening and you have any ideas on going
John,
snowboarding in North Carolina, I wouldn't.
no, don't go to North Carolina. I'm in Salt Lake. You're more than welcome to always come out to the best snow on earth. You're
Oh,
always
Utah. I love Utah. Yeah,
so
definitely.
when you come. Yeah, I'll take you to some spots that'll make you probably want to move here. So just be careful.
I would. That's a whole nother conversation. I would, but I can't.
And did you say you had a pilot's license, or you're working on a pilot's license?
Oh yes, we did talk about that. I forgot about that. Yes, I have a private pilot's license. A
Nice.
long time ago, I actually wanted to be a military aviator. My
Hmm.
father was an A-10 pilot, and
Nice.
I was going to go that same route, but I aged out. I turned into a pumpkin. When you're 27 and you want to fly in the military and you decide at that point you want to do it, it's kind of too late.
Yeah.
So that's a really long story, but as a result of that pursuit, I have a private pilot's license.
Nice. You went past your expiration date in the military.
Yeah, yes, it was not the path for me, and it wasn't my choice, but here I am.
Yeah. Well, this has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it. The time has just flown by, and it's really been great to have you. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your expertise. It's really been terrific, John.
I love it. Thank you, and Chris, also thank you to you for the invitation and the great questions today. I really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you to our audience for tuning in and listening. This has been another episode of the Early AI podcast. And thank you for Carolyn's work behind the scenes, our producer. And we will see you all next time. So again, thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. Great to see you. And thanks for your time today.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
See you guys. Thank you.
Yep. Bye now.
Visit Earley.com to find links to the full podcast on all audio platforms to listen on the go. Thank you for watching. Contact us today at info@earley.com.